C.S. Lewis was one of the great moral and spiritual thinkers of the 20th century. He came into prominence and became wildly popular in England during the dark days of World War II, when he began giving 15-minute talks on BBC radio broadcast. The series of talks was titled Right and Wrong, A Clue to the Meaning of the Universe. The transcripts of those talks later became Lewis's best-selling book, Mere Christianity, initially published in 1952. Almost 4 million copies of the English version of Mere Christianity have been sold, and the book has been translated into 30 languages. C.S. Lewis wrote 30 books before his death on November 22, 1963. You also may recognize that date as the death date of a famous American. There's no way to measure the number of people worldwide impacted by C.S. Lewis in their quest for truth. My guest, Bob Hereford, is undoubtedly one of those people. Some 37 years ago, almost by chance, Bob picked up a copy of Mere Christianity in a bookstore while on vacation. Bob had been raised in the church, and he thought he knew what he believed, but he did not understand why he believed it. For the first time in his life, C.S. Lewis made Christianity make sense. Bob's life was forever changed. Not only did Lewis's writings cause Bob to return to study the Bible from a fresh perspective, but Bob also began to learn all he could about this incredible author. He read many of the books and even committed particular passages to memory. Bob was so impacted that he began speaking to groups about Lewis's teaching. As part of his presentations, he does a characterization of C.S. Lewis. Not only does he quote impactful passages from memory, but he does it with an English accent. You suddenly feel like you are listening to C.S. Lewis on the radio in the 1940s. You will get a taste of his characterizations today. Bob Hereford also wrote a book, and it's about C.S. Lewis, entitled Surprised by Jack, in which he discusses Lewis's impact on his life and highlights truths from 4 of his books. In a world where absolute truths are not so absolute anymore, where many people's belief systems are controlled by their personal appetites, and chronological snobbery is a real disease, well, destruction is on the horizon, and humanity is in danger of being forfeit, according to C.S. Lewis. What we recently saw in Paris at the opening ceremony of the Olympics was in-your-face snobbery, by intention, and it was an affront to all who call themselves Christians. C.S. Lewis's writings and teachings and Bob Hereford's message have never been more relevant or urgent.
Viewing life from a hearse, it could be worse. Laugh, think, and cry with the country undertaker.
This is Bruce Goddard, and you're listening to the View from a Hearse podcast. As I have mentioned, my guest today is Bob Hereford. And he is about to tell you an incredible story how a man that he has never met absolutely changed his life through his writings. So, Bob, thank you for doing this. Thank you for joining me this morning on this podcast.
Well, it's a pleasure, Bruce, and I appreciate the time you're giving to it.
Well, it's much fun. So let's just briefly tell who this man is, C.S. Lewis.
Well, Lewis, his day job was a professor at Oxford University and then later at Cambridge. He was a teacher of professor of literature, medieval and Renaissance literature, wound up being probably the greatest Christian apologist of the 20th century. And I want to explain what an apologist is. I never did like the word.
Right.
Because it sounds like you're being sorry for something.
Right.
But apologist comes from the Greek apologia, which is to explain and defend, and that's what Lewis did in most his writings that I've read. Explain and defended what Christians have believed down through the ages. As he said, long before I was born, and whether I liked it or not, this is what they say they believed.
And so, over 35 years ago, you walked in a bookstore and you were on vacation, and you picked up, I think you said, the only Christian book in the bookstore that you saw, and you picked up this book and you began reading it, and it had great impact. And you ended up now, after 36 years later or whatever, you've been doing presentations about C.S. Lewis. You go to churches, you're showing people, a lot of people don't know who he is or what he wrote, and you even do characterizations of C.S. Lewis in his voice. He was obviously born in Ireland, right? And he was...
Yeah, he was born in Ireland, spent most of his life in England.
So he's got this English accent, and you, part of what you do is the characterizations of him, and you don't read these characterizations, but you do them by memory. You can get a taste a little bit here for what C.S. Lewis is writing. So why don't you, if you don't mind, let's jump into that. Why don't you do a little characterization here?
All right, let me set it up a little bit. This is from Mere Christianity, and it's from the chapter, The Shocking Alternative. And this is what Lewis says finally about Jesus.
Okay.
I am trying here to prevent anyone from saying the really foolish thing that people often say about him. They say, oh, I'm willing to accept Jesus as a great moral teacher, but I don't accept his claim to be God. That, my friends, is the one thing we must not say. You see, a man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on a level with a man who says he's a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. Oh, you must make your choice. Either this man was and is the very Son of God, or else a madman, or something worse. Oh, you could shut him up for a fool. You could spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great moral teacher. He did not leave that open to us. He did not intend to.
And this, folks, so this is a guy from Waycross, Georgia, that you hear him talking in his regular voice like me. He's about as southern as you can get. He's got that down pat. So you've done these presentations, powerful, powerful passage that should whet people's appetites of what C.S. Lewis writes about.
Lewis wrote prose sort of like Mozart wrote music. It was perfect the first time. He hardly ever, he wrote with a pen and an inkwell. and so he just had that gift to, and you can get seduced by his prose.
But you've done a lot of these presentations. Is your entire presentation characterizations, or do you talk about him and then do this?
No, usually I begin by telling how I found the book and how Lewis's background, how he was an atheist, the things that happened to him as a child. His mother died at a young age. His father packed him off to England to boarding school, which was a terrible experience for him. Then he was tutored. At 14, he was tutored by an atheist. But the atheist prepared him for the entrance exams into Oxford. So the Lord works in mysterious ways.
So when you read this book for the first time, Mere Christianity, you just became infatuated with C.S. Lewis. So you started over a period of time, started reading a lot of his works and reading about him and his autobiography, and you've learned all about C.S. Lewis over the years. And you go around in churches and talk about him with a goal to turn people on to C.S. Lewis so they'll buy his books because his writings changed your life. Am I correct?
Yeah, and the thing I did when I wrote the book was surprised by Jack encourage people to read more of Lewis. That was
Right.
right. My purpose.
Bob has written a book called Surprised by Jack by Bob Hereford, and we'll talk about how you can get that before we're done. And it takes you through how this impacted his life and some of the lessons you learned from C.S. Lewis's writings. And I think they called him Jack, right? That's how you got that name. That was because his dog, I remember.
Yeah, he hated the name Clive Staples, and so when his dog died at age 4, he proclaimed that he wanted to be called Jaxie, which was the dog's name, but that was shortened to Jack. So all his friends called him Jack.
So you were literally surprised by Jack when you
Right.
began reading this stuff. So let's go back up. Let's tell the people a little bit about C.S. Lewis. When did he live?
He was born in 1898 and he died in 1963. And incidentally, he died, if you can remember where you were when John Kennedy was assassinated, he died on the same day. Almost at the same hour. Of course, he in Oxford and Kennedy in Dallas, but also Aldous Huxley died that same day, the author of A Brave New World.
So one of the books that C.S. Lewis wrote, folks, and he's written a lot, you can look it up, 30 books, translated in 30 different languages. This guy's a prolific writer, incredible gifted writer. If you like to read, he wrote the Chronicles of Narnia.
Yeah.
His best friend wrote
Lord of the Rings.
Through all of this, Bob Hereford's life was changed by reading and understanding from a rational perspective the message of Christianity. Born in Ireland, lived in England, right? Is that correct?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so when you read the book and you were obviously impacted by the book, then you became interested in Lewis himself. So how did that come about? How did you come about getting so interested in the author?
Well,
I've read a lot of books, and I don't usually go chase the author down, but it had to be a big impact for you to do that.
Well, there are several things that after I read Mere Christianity, there were several things that came to me, but the main one was that this was the first rational explanation, logical explanation for what we believe as Christians. And the main thing it did for me was to make me face what it was I said I believed.
Right.
And that is, I think, the biggest thing it did for me. And just the characterization I did earlier, as Lewis said, there's no middle ground here. Either this is
he's a lunatic or he's Lord, right?
Yeah. And so, I was raised in the church, in Methodist church. I'm sure like my mama, your mama had you there whenever the doors were open. And all the things I had heard growing up, I had never, ever heard these sorts of rational explanations. It doesn't prove there's a God, but what he has to say gives you a firmer foundation about what we've believed, most of us, since childhood.
The truth is, most people don't understand what they believe, and that's what the point is.
Yeah.
You've been going to church all your life, and all of a sudden you were wondering what you did believe, and this gave you a firm foundation. So what other stuff did you learn from Lewis's writings?
Well, I learned how uneducated I was. He uses all sorts of literary and historical things in his writings that I had no clue what they were. I had to go look them up, figure it out. Well, that's all part of it. This may seem like a small point, but I learned I was an auditory learner. My wife has a master's degree in instructional technology from the University of Georgia. That means she was a librarian. and she said you learn 3 different ways. You're the auditory learner, you learn better by listening; visual, you learn better by reading; or kinesthetic, you learn better by doing. But there's some tough stuff that Lewis writes, and if I read it silently, I found out if I would read it aloud to myself, I'd understand it better.
about that.
That may seem like a small point, but it's a big point.
No, it is. It's major. So everybody listening to this is one of the three, and that may be just that little hint may make somebody realize why they don't like to read.
Yeah,
Because they're not
right.
following it. Isn't that true?
That's true. One of the other thing is Lewis always said, if you read something, if you want to know something, go to the original source. How many times did I teach Sunday school and first thing I picked up was a commentary, not the Bible, about what I was going to talk about? Go to the source. There were a number of things other than just his rational arguments for the existence of God, because really he brings you to a point where we're here by some cosmic accident spinning off in space for no reason, or there's a God who created this world for his purposes. And I came to believe, it finally made me say, well, I believe the latter.
Right. And the reason you believe the latter, as you read, is because it made more sense.
Yeah,
Isn't that true? And
yeah,
so he was Lewis. You mentioned it, I think, but Lewis grew up in a Christian home, but he became an atheist, right?
Right. He had a lot of things happen to him early, and he was a veteran in World War I. He was wounded. He saw tremendous carnage and terrible things there, and he was nearly killed. He said his kindly sergeant was killed next to him. It probably died from the shrapnel that may have killed him. And so he came to believe that if there was a God, why was there so much pain and unjustness in the world? And he finally realized that where had he gotten this idea of just and unjust? You can't call a line crooked unless you know something about a straight line. So where had this notion come from? And he finally, in his mind, reasoned that it must have come from someone who made the world and who is a holy, righteous God. Lewis takes us back to the basics, and I use in the book, I use the analogy of Jack Nicklaus, saying whenever he had a problem with his golf, if he wasn't playing the way he ought to, he went back to his original teacher, and the teacher would watch him swinging, and usually he said 9 out of 10 times there was something basically wrong with his swing, and he changed, the grip or the stance or how close he was to the ball. It was something very basic. And on our way, I think we've lost the basics in many cases of our faith, and Lewis helps restore that.
And what you're going to talk about in a little bit is how prophetic he was of what would happen in his world. Although he died in 1963, his writings are more relevant today than they've ever been, right?
I believe that. In Surprised by Jack, I have 4 books that I don't critique, but I explain my understanding of them. One is Mere Christianity, and let me say this about Mere Christianity: it's a kind of book that each chapter stands on its own. In other words, you could start in the middle of the book and read something that is, and you would get everything Lewis wanted you to get out of it, because these were compiled from radio broadcasts he did over the BBC during World War II.
Right. And he became very popular. Right?
Yeah, they were very popular. And in fact, his voice was probably the second most notable voice, recognizable voice on the radio outside of Churchill's.
Have you heard his voice? Have you heard recordings of his voice?
There are some few recordings left of his voice. Yes, it didn't sound like mine on the.
I bet it was close. You did a good job. You do a good job with that. Folks, I'm talking to Bob Hereford from Waycross, Georgia. He's written a book called Surprised by Jack, which really means that he picked up Mere Christianity and he was surprised at what he read. There's 2.4 billion people in this world that claim to be Christians. And I don't know what percentage of that probably don't understand what they believe. And this book and this author and the book and the other books he wrote will open your eyes to what you believe. We're going to be right back as we continue this story. Bob, why did you write the book? What was the purpose of writing the book about C.S. Lewis?
Well, it was mainly to get people interested in his work. In the foreword, that's what I say is I looked up, well, what are you supposed to do in a preface? I'd never written a book. And the main thing is to tell the reader why you wrote the book. And so I wrote the book. So I hope more people would read Lewis. And I wish that this was the kind of book I had when I first read him. Right. It's, there are tomes written about Lewis, some of them 400 and 500 pages, and most people will not do that. I tried to do something simple to just hit the high points.
You identified several of his works that impacted you, so just walk through your book.
The 4 books that are in Surprised by Jack that I talk about is Mere Christianity, The Weight of Glory, Abolition of Man, and the Screwtape Letters. The Screwtape Letters is probably his most well-known apologetic book. It's a book that records letters between an apprentice demon and his senior trainer, Screwtape, and how they try to capture a man for, as he calls, the Father's house, which is the devil. It was probably the first most successful commercial book Lewis ever wrote. I
read it years ago, and I've read parts of it since. But yeah, it's very interesting. It'll keep your attention.
I'll tell you, it's to me, it's probably the greatest psychological analysis or description of sin that I've ever read. And if you can't find yourself in there somewhere, you're not being honest with yourself.
So you identify 4 of his works and kind of give some highlights about and some of your takeaways from reading them, right? That's basically what you're doing, and whetting people's appetite to go read these books.
Right.
And know about C.S. Lewis. So why do you think the writings are important today? We live in a different world than you and I grew up in. Why is this important today?
Lewis used to say, that which is not eternal is eternally out of date. And there are eternal truths. I don't care when you live, where you're living, that are true and are still things that we need to agree to and to work at. And Lewis explains a lot of that in his writings, and I think he would be amazed at how far we've moved astray from those eternal truths. One of the things Lewis was told by a friend that helped him come back to faith was this notion of chronological snobbery.
Yep.
And Lewis says that chronological snobbery is the uncritical acceptance of the intellectual climate of our own age, and the assumption that whatever has gone out of date is on that account discredited. In other words, just because something old is old doesn't mean it's not useful. And we just discount things that are no longer done as being out of date and therefore of not of any value.
And so what happens is, as time goes on, what we believed as truth, and now the society doesn't accept it, so they don't accept it, so we assume it's not true anymore.
Right, yeah. the church is really assigned with the task of helping change the culture.
In the abolition of man, one of the things that really got my attention is this mindset of the head, the chest, and the belly.
Yeah.
That he talks about as a great illustration of kind of what I believe is going on in the world today. Tell me what that's about.
Lewis uses the analogy in the abolition of man, and the bottom line of the abolition of man is that once we're in a position of trying to make everything the way we want it, and that will ultimately be our abolition. That will be our demise, is when we try to make everything the way we want it. But Lewis uses, and this was an old Greek metaphor or example, was that the mind rules the intellect, the stomach is the appetite of the human, and the chest moderates the feelings and the desires between our wants from the stomach and our mentality of the mind. And Lewis says that we're building men without chests, that we want of them virtue and enterprise, but all the time we laugh at traitors, we castrate and bid the geldings be fruitful. So he's saying we're removing the chest, the part of the human that's able to moderate between our desires and our intellect.
And that's what you see going on in the world, just stuff we've never experienced in our life. People doing what they want or whatever they think, and it's not being moderated by anything, right?
Yep.
That's what we're experiencing. And that book is not only powerful, but it's very prophetic.
I absolutely agree. It's probably the most prophetic of all his writings, and it's a difficult read. I don't. He starts with an example. Two English professors from Australia sent him a book to read, to critique, and as soon as he started reading it, he said,
hogwash.
Yeah, I can't say anything good about it.
Right.
So he kept the book and the authors anonymous, and but he went on to scathingly attack what he thought their ideas about English and words and what they mean is just absolutely tragic, and that it would lead to the kind of thinking we're seeing today.
So talk about the impact that your present. I know you've done a bunch of presentations about C.S. Lewis. What's the feedback you get from people when they learn about him?
Well, it's really been very gratifying. I think they have the same reaction I had, that they'd never heard these sort of explanations about what we believe, and I think they being able to do it from memory and with an English accent just adds to the if I sat there and read it to them, or it's not quite, doesn't have quite the same effect. That's why I decided to commit some of this to memory and do it with an English accent, because I thought it would be more impactful. The thing about Lewis is that we all have to make that leap of faith. I mean, and the Lord requires that we have that faith. But Lewis's stuff for me made that leap a little shorter jump. I guess that's the best way I can put it.
At the end of the day, when you read it and you begin to understand what you really believed, how did that impact you personally? How has that impacted you over the last 35 years? What's changed in your life from the impact of his writings and taking you, like you said, to the Bible, to the original Word of God? Just talk about how that's impacted you.
Well, it's made me see a lot of things about myself, about what I see going on around me, that I would have never questioned before. And I think that's probably the biggest the biggest thing that there's a chapter in Your Christianity called the Greatest Sin. And Lewis says that the greatest sin is pride. And that really hit me because I realized there were a lot of things that I was doing in my life out of pride and nothing else.
As most everybody else, right?
Yeah. And he closes that chapter by saying the best test to know if you're prideful is that if you don't think you're prideful, you absolutely are prideful.
That's true. Two things. How can people get in contact with you to get you to come to turn their group on to C.S. Lewis and your presentation? And the same breath, how do you get your book?
Well, I don't have a website or anything like that, but I'll be glad to give you an email.
Okay, do that.
All right. B as in Bob, B Hereford, Hereford, the number 8 at gmail.com.
bhereford8@gmail.com.
Correct.
So you can get in touch with Bob Hereford at that address, so they can get a book from you through that as well.
Well, yeah, I can mail them one, or they can get one off of Amazon or any other thing like that. Yeah.
You can get his book and get an understanding of the impact from C.S. Lewis, and I know you can find C.S. Lewis books, Mere Christianity, Screwtape Letters, The Abolition of Man. They go on and on. He's written a book about grief that is very powerful. So many books out there. So hopefully you had your eyes open a little bit. If you are a believer or you are thinking about and wondering what you do believe, I highly suggest that you get turned on to C.S. Lewis' writing. It was anointed. His writings has changed a lot of people's lives. Have you got any closing comments, Bob? Anything else that we missed?
I just hope that people will at least try to see what Lewis is saying. And I think he hits the mark in a lot that's being missed in the church today. And that, we're all sinners in need of repentance. And that's the basics. The closer we get to the Lord, the more we're going to feel that joy and understanding of why we're here.
Folks, you can get Bob to come to your group. You have to arrange that with him, and he'll just send him an email. If you want to ask him some questions about this, send him an email. You can get his book on Amazon. Again, the book is called Surprised by Jack by Bob Hereford, Hereford. Bob, thank you so much, my friend. I appreciate you doing this. Look forward to meeting up with you and seeing you one day soon.
Good. I hope so, Bruce. Thank you very much. This has been a very pleasurable experience, and I appreciate it.
Viewing life from a hearse, it could be worse. Laugh, think, and cry with the country undertaker.